And after the war with Hezbollah in July, he probably would have been out of office. And he's hanging on very much by a thread right now. And Netanyahu has been blasted by the Israeli left-leaning press, is now considered the top candidate for future prime minister because they want a strong leader, not a double-minded leader like Ehud Olmert. What's also interesting is the White House biblical role. 1990 to the present. Woodrow Wilson favored Israel becoming a nation. He favored the Balfour Agreement, which was the agreement when Israel obtained the land that they now have. What's also interesting is there were a couple presidents that lost their life at very key times. FDR gave King Saud a letter on Israel, stating that if Israel wanted to become a nation, that FDR would immediately pick up the phone and call King Saud. He put this in writing. A week later, FDR died and was replaced by Harry Truman, who helped Israel become a nation. John F. Kennedy was pressuring Israel on their nuclear plan. John F. Kennedy did not want another nuclear country. They had France, you had Russia, you had the United States, and he did everything he could to pressure Ben-Gurion to stop this. Ben-Gurion stepped down as prime minister, was replaced. Kennedy started getting concerned about the election, took a little bit of pressure off Israel, said, okay, we want to have oversight on what you're doing. Kennedy was assassinated, and he was replaced by Lyndon Johnson, a great friend of Israel who armed Israel militarily right before the Six-Day War. Incredible timing. Richard Nixon's Middle East peace efforts, or Israeli-Palestinian peace efforts, were stopped by Watergate. Kissinger and former Secretary of State Rogers were very active in the process. They were really moving forward. They were hoping they were going to work out a peace deal, and Watergate stopped Nixon's peace efforts. Gerald Ford went after election, was not very involved in the process. Jimmy Carter became the next president. He found a diplomat in Sadat. See, Sadat, in his Yom Kippur War, was trying to take over Israel, but he was defeated, so he says, we can't defeat them militarily. Let's go to the peace table. So Jimmy Carter and Sadat and Begin sat down and worked out the Camp David agreements and also the Israeli-Egyptian peace accord, and that was the deal. Right after Carter's supposed success, the United States experienced the highest gas prices in history, the highest interest rates in history, an Iran hostage crisis, a failed presidency, and no legacy outside of a legacy of a presidential time in office where his party did not want to have anything to do with him, disowned him for all practical purposes. Fortunately, Carter's done some great humanitarian things over the last couple years, but unfortunately, in the last 12 months, Jimmy Carter is now speaking out once again about how things should be done in Israel. I thought it was pretty humorous this year as Jimmy Carter was the one that was responsible for bringing the Palestinians into the peace process, was also the head vote monitor this year when the Palestinians had their big election in late January. Here's Jimmy Carter with his clipboard, with all his vote monitors, giving the news that Hamas now had 74 of 132 seats in the new parliamentary government. Hamas, who does not acknowledge Israel's right to exist, Hamas, who are terrorist organizations, this is part of Jimmy Carter's legacy in Israel. Ronald Reagan was reluctant to move forward into the peace process. He was convinced by Secretary of State Schultz and Arafat and Shimon Peres that this was a time for peace. Reagan reluctantly moved forward into the process, and then the Iran-Contra scandal stopped his peace efforts. Israel was involved, and the whole situation became very problematic. President Bush had a problem. It's called Ross Perot. Ross Perot helped him from getting elected, and I'll go into that in just a bit. Every time Bill Clinton was pressuring Israel, a scandal broke out for him. The Lewinsky scandal broke the day that Netanyahu was in the White House, January 24th, 1998. Arafat and Netanyahu were in and out of the White House. Enormous pressure on Netanyahu. The same day this Lewinsky scandal breaks, it becomes a major embarrassment for him. And President George W. Bush, the president wanted to become the education president. has been involved with a very costly and expensive war on terror. Matter of fact, I read yesterday that we have now spent $500 billion in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the war on terror. And I'll go into that in just a little bit. It's a very interesting connection. But during Bush, Clinton, and Bush's 14 years in the process, we've had 58 major catastrophes and our political crises that happen at the very same time or within 24 hours of the United States presidents applying pressure on Israel to divide their land. The greater the pressure on Israel, the greater the corresponding catastrophe in America. The 12 costliest hurricanes in U.S. history. The 10 costliest insurance events in U.S. history. There's a little bit of overlap between the first two. 3 of the 4 largest tornado outbreaks in U.S. history, and the two largest terrorism events in U.S. history, both World Trade Center events, had a connection to us putting pressure on Israel. See, the God of Israel is our homeland security. We have been blessed over and over and over again by God's restraining hand over this nation. But when you cross the line, you interfere with his plan for the nation of Israel and attempt to divide his land and give it to enemies of Israel, there are consequences. During President Bush's first 4 years and Bill Clinton's 8 years, for a total of 12 years, there were 29 major catastrophes or catastrophic events. During President Bush's next 5 years in office, there have been 28. 29 in 12 years, 28 in 5 years. Much greater intensity in President Bush's 5 years because we're moving further into some serious stuff. President Bush, October 30th, November 1st, 1991, Bush and Gorbachev co-sponsored the Madrid Land for Peace Conference. A couple weeks before Madrid, Gorbachev had a coup. He beat it, was able to be there at Madrid, but 5 weeks after Madrid, he was the former president of the Soviet Union, and Boris Yeltsin was now the president of Russia. This happens over and over again. I don't care what leader you are, you touch it, you're going to pay the price. President Bush, this was a payback to his buddies in other nations. He said, with Desert Storm, we had a big problem with Saddam Hussein, and he told all the world leaders, come join us in this war with Saddam. And he told the Arabs that he would sponsor a Land for Peace conference in Madrid. This was his payback. To put things in perspective, President Bush, right after Desert Storm, had the highest approval rating in history at 91%. We've never had a president anywhere near that approval rating. After Desert Storm, he and James Baker started moving forward. They decided to have the Madrid Land for Peace Conference. And at the time, he was calling on Israel to give up the land, their land. The perfect storm, which it had begun to develop, produced 100-foot Atlantic Ocean waves and was sending 30-foot waves into President Bush's Kennebunkport, Maine home as he is calling on Israel to leave the land. Not weeks, not months, not days, not years. At the time he's in Madrid calling on Israel to leave the land, his property is under water. Just under $1 million worth of damage. Bill Clinton. Actually, Bill Clinton became president. At that time of Madrid, President Bush, 12 months later, went from being the president of the United States to losing. When President Bush started Madrid, things started going haywire. That's what happens when you start working with Israel's land. Things get politically disruptive. I have 9 different periods of disruption President George W. Bush has experienced. Anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months when he's involved in the process. When he backs off, things settle. Politically, personally, problems with Iraq, problems with Iran, problems with North Korea. The greater the pressure on Israel, the worse his situation gets for him in Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. It's incredible how this happens like this, over and over again. But what happened? President Bush went from having the highest approval rating in history at 91% to 18 months later being out of office. Gaffes, problems, Perot was in, Perot was out. He lost his campaign chairman. Lee Atwater, who fortunately became a believer in Jesus just before he died. Secretary of State Baker.